Now, before I start giving my lecture proper, I just want to remind people about what's happening this week outside of your normal studies, which is that this week is computing week, and I'd strongly encourage people to attend as many of the talks that are being given as possible. I'm sure you've been informed of this already, but tomorrow, for example, is when it begins, and there are lots of really good short presentations being made by fairly recent graduates, really, of both the SSD degree and the applied computing degree. So it would be given that you're on the cusp now of graduating and moving into industry or research, then listening to these presentations would be, I think, very beneficial to you. Could even help you in interviews. Who knows? The type of questions that you might be asked about. What do you expect the first year of your work to be like? Well, if you listen to these presentations being made tomorrow morning, you'll get some insights, as well as the careers fairs in the later morning. On Wednesday, I'm going to be attending these myself because I think they're going to be very interesting talks on the role of AI in software development and computing generally. So try and get to those as well. Similarly, on Thursday morning, some more. So it's AI really all the way. Surprise, surprise, really, that it's dominating all discussions around not just our industry, but other industries as well. So I would encourage you to try and attend as many of those as I will, except maybe for the last one, because that presentation was made last year, and I saw it last year, and it was really good. And then on Friday, probably not really relevant to ye, uh, but certainly tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday, try and get to as many, if not all, of the talks that are happening. Okay, back to Agile. Now, today, really, all I want to talk about is the first assignment that I'd like to give you. We've effectively finished the containerization stroke Docker material, although we will come back to it again later on in the module, if not straight after the midterm break, actually. Not directly, but kind of indirectly, we'll be using Docker. But in terms of the first assignment, uh, again, it's hardly surprising that it's going to focus on Docker. And so what I'll be asking you to do is to take a multi-container application, which I will provide you with, and containerize it, which in short really means writing the Docker compose file to start up and get the multi-container application running. Really, what Docker has been all about is hooking up containers with one another, getting them to connect to one another. It's not so much about software development, it's about integrating the different parts of your application's architecture, I guess. So that's the objective in just in one sentence, okay, to fully containerize a multi-container application. If we scroll down to the application itself, so it looks like there's going to be, at least anyway, 4 containers that make up this application. And so the nature of the application is you've got this web API, which I've called the Movies API, and it will receive requests, HTTP requests, for a list of all movies or information on a specific movie. The movie information is stored in a MongoDB database. And down here we've got the Mongo Express web app, which we're familiar with, which allows us to administer the database. So there's nothing really new in this container, and there isn't really anything new in this container either. Now we've got another container over here, which is going to be running the Redis image. Now, the role that plays in this overall architecture, it plays two roles really. It it plays a caching role and a rate limiting role. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when the movies API container receives a request for either for a specific movie, then and if it's the first time it's received that request, then it'll go to the database to get the details of that movie and return it back to the client. But it will also store it in the Redis server. The next time it receives a request for the same movie, it will now check to see, does it have that movie in the Redis server? If it does, then it will read it from there and return it. It won't actually take it from the MongoDB database. Redis is a high performance caching server. The other role that Redis is going to play is if the Movies API receives a request to return all of the movies in the database, and it receives that request multiple times in a very short period of time, okay, then what it will do is it will maintain a counter. And I think I've set the counter so that if it receives more than 10 requests over, let's say, a 3 or 4 minute period, then when it receives the 11th request, it will deny the user access to the information. So it's limiting the amount of uh, successive requests for all of the movie's data. It limits it uh, uh, to a certain upper limit, 10, I think I've set it to. And if those requests come in quick succession, so it's actually using the Redis server to maintain the counter for each time it receives the get all movies request. And if that counter reaches 10, then it knows that it will stop responding to the get all movies request. Again, it'll stop maybe for about 5 minutes, but then it will reset the counter back to zero again and allow more requests to come in. So this Redis server is performing two roles really. It's caching and it's also performing rate limiting. But okay, that's what its role is, and that's what this movies API um, container is doing. It's talking to these two other containers. And from a Docker point of view, that's really all you're worried about, that it can communicate with the both of these servers. So you can just read that. So that's what I'm saying down here. Here I'm telling you, look, these are the four images that you will be using. So I've provided the image for the Movies API. You can pull that, do a Docker pull on that from my Docker Hub account. The MongoDB one you already have. The Redis one, you can pull that as well, and this is its full tag, Redis Alpine, and the Mongo Express image you already have as well. When you're using Docker Compose with these images, you need to know about what environment variables the images need. And so I'm specifying here that for the movies API image, there are three environment variables. This one, which you need to set to the full URL of the MongoDB server. And we know from the stuff that we've done in the labs that a MongoDB server's URL takes that form. Yeah. The second or another environment variable is the URL of the Redis server. Now, its URL actually is quite straightforward. It looks like that. It's the Redis protocol and then the domain name of the Redis server. There's a third environment variable, this one here, which you just hard code to the value false. Okay, so that's the environment variables. I don't mention it here, but the movies API is listing on port 9000, so you do have to map that port to a port on the host, and you may as well map it to post 9000 on the host as well. The environment variables for the MongoDB server, you already know about that. Similarly, you already know about the environment variables for the Mongo Express web app. And the Redis container doesn't require any environment variables. Here I'm telling you about something about container isolation that you need to take on board. I'm saying that the Mongo Express container, it should not be able to access the Redis container. And, we can see that from up here. Okay, there's no connection here, so it should not be possible for this container to, ping this one, or shouldn't be able to connect to it. And also we're told that I think these two here, the movies API container and the Express container, they shouldn't be able to access or connect to one another either. They shouldn't be able to communicate with one another. So that's obviously got to do with the whole networking that you set up in your Docker Compose file. The MongoDB container, okay, I don't think I mentioned that one actually. So I'm saying that the Mongo Express web app should not be able to access the Redis, oh yeah, and the Mongo API containers, and also the MongoDB container should not be able to access the Redis container. Now, down here, I'm saying that when you run Docker Compose up, if you're running it and you're in kind of development mode, then maybe for this particular application, something that you would like to happen is for the database, the MongoDB database, to be seeded with some initial data. Now, that's something we haven't spoken about at all. So you need to do a little bit of Google searching to find out how might I do that. Also, uh, when you're running Docker Compose up and you want to, let's supposing you're starting up your multi-container application for a production environment setting as opposed to a development environment setting. Well, I'm saying here that when you're doing Docker Compose up and the intent is that you are now running it in a production context, then you don't want the database seeding to happen then. And also, let's say you don't want the Mongo Express web app to be started either. You only want the Movies API, the Redis server, and the MongoDB server. Those three containers are the only three that should be started up. there should be no seeding of the database, of the MongoDB database, and the Express app should not start up either. And again, that's something that you would have to do some investigation on as to how you might be able to achieve that in your using Docker Compose. Grading spectrum, if you get some of the application stack working, then you can get between 40 and 50. If you're looking for between 50 and 70, you'd need your stack to be fully integrated. All of the containers are up and running, and you've adhered to the container isolation constraints that I spoke about there a moment ago. Are we saying that's it? Yeah, that's it. In the 70 to 85 bracket, you're also including database seeding. You've worked out how to achieve that. And then in the 85 plus, you're achieving all of these, plus you've actually worked out how to have a development versus a production stack, how to get those up and running based on the explanation that I gave you there a few moments ago. So you're able to do Docker Compose up for a development environment and Docker Compose up for a production environment, and they create slightly different stacks. Now, as a startup, you need to do Docker pull on the Movies API image. And I'm also giving you the kind of a starting project folder structure, which looks something like this. So when you unzip the archive, this is what you have. Okay, Docker ignore, that's okay. I'm giving you just a simple environment file, but you may want to add to that. Then I'm giving you a starting Docker Compose, and really all it has is part of the container setup for the Movies API. So the images, as I've said, the container name is whatever you wanted to call it. I've called it that. And this is the port mapping that you might use, because I did say that the Movies API is listing on port 9000. So I'm mapping it to the same port on the host. But, there's other stuff that you will need to specify for this particular service, to use the proper word, within my stack, as well as all the other stuff. So you'd be adding to, like, essentially, the only your focus will be completely on the Docker Compose file or files. Okay, there's no source code that you need to be worried about. Okay, so really, this is the extent of the project that you're going to be working on. Now, I've also provided a seeding file in JSON format, which may or may not be useful. Okay, so it's just got a couple of movies, and okay, I've decided that this is the structure of a movie. So the movie items in our collection in the database, in the MongoDB database, will look like this. Just to show you the application up and running. So I've already done a Docker Compose up of the kind of completed Docker Compose file with seeding included. And so if I go to here, okay, here's my stack. I have my containers, and if I go to the Movies API one, which is this one here. this is the kind of homepage. It's not really a homepage as such because it's an API, but what you get here is what's happening here now is the movies API is pinging the client to see that it's still kind of connected. So if you see this happening, you know that things are looking good. So it'll keep on pinging it. But if you go to this URL slash movies, then this is the full set of movies that I've stored in my MongoDB database. Yeah. And if I take any one of them, let's say this one, just grab the ID of that's the MongoDB ID of one of them and tag that on. Then you get the details of one particular movie. So really my movies API, which is what I'm communicating with here, I'm sending HTTP GET requests to my movies API. There's really only two endpoints, get all movies and get a specific movie. Now, if I go back to the get all movies, now, if I keep hitting refresh on this, once I get beyond 10 requests, I'm going to get an error back from the movies API, and it's effectively telling me that you've hit the limit of the number of successive get all movie requests that's allowed within a short period of time. So if I do that now, if I just keep hitting the refresh, okay, there's the error, essentially, or the response that's coming back from. It's not an error as such, but because it's what's expected coming back from the movies API. And if you read it, it's telling you, look, that you're only allowed 10 requests within a short period of time, but I seem to have tried to get 11 successive requests. And if I leave it sit there for a couple of minutes and come back again, then it will have reset the counter back to zero, and you'll be able to get the full set of movies again. So that's all the movies API does, right? Um, if I, in terms of Mongo Express, which I think I have my Mongo Express web app, and you can see here, right, that I've created a table called TMDB movies. Now that's okay, and if I go into that, there's a movies collection, and that's where all my data is. Now, if you're not able to achieve the automatic seeding of your MongoDB database, then you can add one or two movies into this movies collection kind of manually using this Express web app, and just to prove that the movies API is still working. Because if there is no data in the MongoDB database, then all you will see when you try and get all movies, as in here, then all you'll get is an empty array as the response. So an empty array still tells you that the movies API is successfully communicating with the MongoDB database, though. Um, let's just actually try a refresh to see has it timed out. Yeah. So the time it has reset the limit, the rate limiter in the Redis server back to zero. So I'm now able to make requests again. But as I kind of said at the outset, obviously it's good to know what the movies API does. You don't really have to know how it does it. That's the detailed coding inside the movies API. That's not the focus of this assignment. The focus is connecting up your containers, uh, satisfying the container isolation requirements, potentially being able to get the seeding of the MongoDB database, achieve that in an automated way. So there's something that will have to go into your Docker Compose YAML file to achieve that, but you'd have to do some research on how you might be able to achieve it. And also, the other kind of high level challenge is the, the ability to have a different stack created depending on whether you're in production, whether you want to start up the stack for production mode or development mode. The names of the modes don't really matter, right? But that's typically what we are interested in when we are creating a multi-container application. We'd like to create slightly different stacks for different scenarios. The scenarios I'm saying are development environment versus development mode versus production mode. So back to the specification. Oh yeah, well this is all I'm showing you here is my Docker. Let's go back to it here. So the image you'll be pulling is this one here. Yeah. And again, as I said, you don't need to know anything about the internal workings of the image as such. Back to the specification. I think I've kind of covered it really. Okay, the only thing I've skipped over is this is worth 20%. I'm setting the deadline as the 5th of the 11th, which is sort of the Tuesday, I think, when we come back after the midterm break. And you can read the rest yourself. It is very important, just down here, it's very important that you keep a Git log of your as you progress through this assignment. So you need to be submitting Git commit very regularly. And really all you'll be changing is the Docker Compose YAML file. But every time because presumably the way you go about this is you'll write some Docker Compose code, you'll try and deploy that. There may be a problem. You make some edits to your Docker Compose file. You'll try deploying that. More problems, something works, something doesn't work. But essentially, every time you try and do a Docker Compose up, before you've done that, you should do a Git commit. Even if what you're committing is not working code as such, you do need to keep a record of how you progressed through this assignment. If I get a submission and there is only 2 commits, that's hardly believable, really, that you managed to get it all working by just making changes, 2 sets of changes to your Docker Compose file. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of trial and error, but I like to see the trial and error that is happening. And the only evidence I have of that is in your Git commits. Okay, I'll just pause in case people have any immediate questions. I'm sure there's something I've left out, but do, do people have any questions that come to mind immediately, I wonder? Should I check the chat to see is there something going on there? I don't see anything. No. No. Right. So that's really all I want to cover today. I'm not going to start covering new material. Again, I'll remind you about Computing Week this week. And when we come back, I'll start a new topic. I haven't decided yet whether I'll either pick testing, automated testing, or CI/CD. I haven't kind of decided yet which way I go. But as I said, we we will encounter Docker again, and there might be one or two little aspects of it that I haven't covered so far that I will need to cover when I'm looking at those other topics. So for once, I'm finishing early. If there aren't any questions, I will be available on Slack so ordinarily we would have a 3-hour lab tomorrow morning. I will be online during then, but hopefully you'll actually be at the computing week talks. But you can contact me outside of that time if you have any questions on the assignment. I would prefer if people put the questions on the general channel on Slack so that everybody sees the answers that I give. But if other than that, you can ask me on a direct message. Right, I'm only going to stop waffling on now at this stage, I think, and I will end the lecture here. So I guess I'll be in contact with G over Slack. Other than that, enjoy the midterm break, and I'll talk to you after that. Okay, bye bye.